debut party here in the Stuckeman family building. Those of you who are watching online, you're welcome. Dear Fonna, dear Teddy, on behalf of the Department of Architecture here at the College of Arts and Architecture at Penn State University, you are welcome. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules today to share with us. The title of the talk that they will be presenting today is Unwalling Citizenship. And I first wanted to acknowledge the ongoing struggles that are taking place across the world right now, in which people are taking action in response to their governments, to their environments, to the climate, and to layers of accumulated human history, especially in those places and spaces that are especially connected with our community here at the Stuckeman School, from Iran to Pakistan to the Ukraine and others, and I can add, I believe, Pennsylvania and the United States. In light of this, allow me to also share with you an acknowledgement of land which has been crafted in collaboration with the Indigenous Peoples Student Association and the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance here at Penn State. The Pennsylvania State University campuses are located on the original homelands of the Erie, Haudenosaunee, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora, Lenape, the Delaware Nation, the Delaware Tribe, the Stockbridge Munsee, the Shawnee, the Absentee, the Eastern and Oklahoma, Susquehannock, and Osage Nations. As a land-grant institution, we acknowledge and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands and our place in that history. As I said, the title of this talk is Unwalling Citizenship, which is, I think, in so many ways, a timely one for today and for this moment. Sometimes we spend so much time talking about architecture that we forget that for so long, the city was itself a form of architecture, and the way in which citizens were defined by the people who had access to the inside of the walls of the city versus those who were kept outside the walls of the city is so foundational to our ideas about architecture and the production of the city, and yet so often remain unspoken. Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman are principals of Estudio Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman. They join us virtually today from California. Their work engages what they've spoken of as citizenship culture, particularly around the border of Mexico and the United States, a network of civic spaces that they have co-developed with border communities to cultivate regional and global solidarities. They ask, in this increasingly walled world, and with the surge of anti-immigrant sentiments that seems to be arising everywhere, can the idea of citizenship be recuperated for more emancipatory and inclusive democratic agendas? Their practice investigates borders, informal urbanization, civic infrastructure, and public culture. I would mention, as we were just speaking before as well, that we're super fortunate that they're taking time today in particular to share with us, because they have essentially a whole slew of recent publications which are now entering into the public. 2 monographs with MIT Press, the first Spatializing Justice, and a second Socializing Architecture Top-Down, Bottom-Up, which I believe was maybe just published. And then also with Hache Khan's, a third forthcoming book, Unwalling Citizenship, to be published with Verso. So with no further ado, let me try and turn the virtual microphone over to the 2 of you. And once again, thank you for taking the time to join us. Fonna and Teddy, you're welcome here to the Stuckeman School.
Thank you.
Thank you, DK. Thank you.
DK, that was a beautiful and warm and moving introduction, and we're honored truly to be with you, to share our work on sanctuary spaces at the San Diego-Tijuana border. So I'll just pull up the slides. Are they full screen? Yeah, there we go. Okay. We really see the San Diego-Tijuana region as a microcosm of all of the injustices and indignities experienced by vulnerable people across the globe. Political violence, climate disruption, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, border building everywhere, deepening inequality, and the steady decay of public thinking. We live and work a few miles away from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego-Tijuana is a lightning rod of American nativism. And although the news cameras come and go, tens of thousands of Central American and Haitian migrants wait at the wall for asylum that never comes, often reviled by the Mexican public as a nuisance or an infestation, or else they sit in US detention centers as tools of deterrence, exposed to a raging pandemic, and until very recently, separated forcibly from their children. It has been particularly devastating in recent years to witness the emotional impact on children, their fear, and the inevitable psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. Hopefully, relief on the horizon. This remains to be seen, but the prospect of more border porosity in the coming period is drawing even more people north. Conditions are intensifying here every day, and climate change will accelerate these flows in the coming years. A recent United Nations survey found that 72% of arriving migrants at our southern border are agricultural workers, and that agricultural instability was a major factor in their decision to walk north. Everyone tends to see northward migration in this part of the world as a function of violence and poverty. And of course, this is true. But climate change is what we might call a threat multiplier. It deepens human suffering, makes poverty and food insecurity worse. It aggravates violence, accelerates human displacement, and ultimately compounds the reasons why people are walking north. Some international agencies refuse to characterize these people as refugees, seeing them instead as economic migrants who are sort of pulled toward a better life rather than pushed by catastrophe. This distinction is really significant because it means that these people are not entitled to international refugee protection under the Geneva Convention. This kind of thinking needs to change in an era of accelerating climate migration. For huge numbers of people on this planet who depend on agriculture or on the sea, the economy and the environment, well, they're the same thing. Now, border communities and activists on both sides of the wall continue to confront injustice and productively circumvent policies and practices that criminalize migrants. Over the years, Teddy and I have accompanied some of this bottom-up emancipatory activity in close partnership with agencies at the front lines. In recent years, these struggles have also attracted artists and cultural producers from around the world to engage in sort of gestures of performative protest. But we've been sometimes critical of this uptick in ephemeral, kind of extractive cultural action that dips in and out of the conflict without a sense or commitment to what happens after the happening, right? Instead, we've been advocating for a longer view of resistance in this region. We're advancing strategic thinking about cultural, institutional, and spatial transformation in this border region. We've designed a system that connects our design lab with conditions in the field and have built a network of sanctuary spaces on both sides of the wall called the UCSD community stations. Here, universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources and to collaborate on research, dialogue, cultural and educational activities, and urban design build projects, including migrant housing and environmental infrastructure. From this work, several core commitments have emerged, what we call building blocks that ground our research-based practice. As we move through our talk, you'll encounter a series of yellow pages that are drawn from our new book, Spatializing Justice, which was published this fall with MIT Press and Hajikans. The larger monograph on the right will actually appear just afterward in the winter, in sort of early winter. So I'll begin by introducing some of these building blocks. Teddy will then take you on a tour of the community station sites, and then I'll come back and conclude with a few words about connecting our local work here with border zones across the world. So to begin, we radicalize the local. We've always resisted the idea that global justice is something that happens out there in the world somewhere far away. Living and working where we do, we don't need to go far away to engage territorial conflict, migration, poverty, and climate injustice. We are minutes away from an international border in crisis, and this enables an amazing proximity between studio and field, between theory and practice, what we think of as a critical proximity. Of course, going local here means recognizing ourselves as a region, as a site of interdependence and cooperation. Despite the wall and the ugly political rhetoric designed to divide us, we are a binational ecology of flows and circulation, and our future here is intertwined. Air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, justice, these things don't stop at walls. Border zones are unrelentingly porous things, and these flows shape the transgressive hybrid identities and everyday practices in this part of the world. We are committed to decolonizing knowledge. We are keenly attuned to power dynamics when universities arrive in communities and are critical of both sort of extractive research methods and humanitarian problem-solving missions. We don't do applied research, and we do charity. Design culture is filled with sort of vertical assumptions, right? That we know more, that we are trained to solve the world's problems if only they would listen to us. We are committed to horizontal practices of co-production, engaging communities as partners with knowledge and agency. Everyone contributes, everyone learns, and we do things together in the border region that nobody could do alone. Along these lines, institutions with power too often take for granted the resources communities invest when they work with us: time, space, social capital, labor, knowledge. As a matter of epistemic justice and labor equity, these contributions need to be validated and compensated. We build trust bridges, long-term partnerships between our university and border communities. So we're really there for the long haul. We are committed to learning from the bottom up. We condemn the economic forces that marginalize people into slums, but we are continually inspired by the ingenious self-built logics, the vibrancy of informal market dynamics, and the solidarity of communities confronting marginalization, scarcity, and danger. While the informal border neighborhoods where we work are typically denigrated by formal planners and policymakers as ugly, criminal, neglected, to be avoided, to be cleared, to be cleaned up, we observe intensely active, creative urban agents who challenge the dominant paradigms of urban growth that exclude them. They demonstrate other, more inclusive and collective ways of inhabiting the city. Ultimately, we are engaged in a cultural project of building cross-border citizenship culture in the San Diego-Tijuana region, a sense of belonging that is defined not by the nation state or the documents you carry in your pocket, but by the shared interests and aspirations among people who inhabit a violently disrupted civic space. We reject ideas of citizenship that fragment and divide us rather than unite us. We seek to inspire more inclusive imaginaries of belonging and coexistence in this contested territory. Border regions really are a natural laboratory for reimagining citizenship along these lines. We believe public space must be a public good, activated with civic dialogue and infused with resources to increase public knowledge and capacity for political and environmental action. We reject conventional strategies of urban redevelopment that turn our public spaces into exclusive enclaves of consumption that typically benefit the private developers and nobody else. Our cultural strategies are inspired by a 20th century lineage of Latin American civic experimentation and urban pedagogy. In contexts of dramatic violence and social fragmentation, cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, Bogota, and Medellin, Colombia, sought to heal the wounds of history and mobilize a cohesive civic identity through bottom-up participatory cultural action. The way the city of Bogota, for example, used street mimes, urban games, and theatrical public disruptions to transform urban norms, or the way Medellin transformed urban remainders in neglected zones into vibrant civic spaces that prioritized access and education for all. Our community stations are a model of urban co-development between public universities, municipalities, and community organizations to build spaces of dignity in the city's periphery. They're programmed for education and civic activity. Each community station is designed, funded, built, programmed, and maintained collaboratively between our campus and a community-based organization. Now, a tour of the UCSD community stations and just a hint about what happens in these spaces.
For us then, urban justice is a distributive concept. It entails not only the redistribution of resources, but also the redistribution of knowledges. As a distributed system of public spaces transgressing the wall, the community stations spatialize social justice. We designed the system as both a collaborative education platform and a model of shared urban intervention. We claimed that the economic and programmatic power of our public university can be leveraged for co-developing the city with migrant communities. We have built 4 in total, 2 in San Diego, 2 in Tijuana. We will share with you 2 that focus primarily on emergency and migrant housing, one on each side of the border. So let's go on a tour now, starting on our campus and moving from north to south. The UCSD Casa Community Station is a partnership with the nonprofit organization Casa Familiar, a 30-year-old community-based social service organization. It is located in the border neighborhood of San Isidro, site of the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere. The community is 90% Latinx and has one of the highest unemployment rates, lowest median household income, and the worst air quality in San Diego County. Over the years, San Isidro has been our laboratory for researching the positive impact of immigrants in the transformation of American neighborhoods. We have documented how Tijuana's non-conforming mixed uses migrate northbound and how these pixels of difference transform the large homogeneous swaths of exclusionary land uses of San Diego's sprawl into more sustainable, plural, and complex environments. So when Tijuana's confetti of non-conforming uses hits the ground in San Diego, they alter existing mono-use parcels across inner city neighborhoods into more complex social, economic, and cultural environments. These are migrant urbanizations of retrofit, as older neighborhoods are adapted into alternative bottom-up spaces of socialization and economy. These practices reflect the everyday survival strategies of migrant communities who negotiate boundaries, spaces, and resources simultaneously. And this is how cookie cutter subdivisions in San Diego are retrofitted by migrant communities, such as this mid-city post-war bungalow that was transformed into a Buddhist temple by Vietnamese immigrants. We would never imagine that the post-war American dream, exemplified by the detached single-family suburban dwelling, would be transformed over time by the entrepreneurial energies of migrant communities. So researching these cross-border migrant flows has been essential for us as we propose new migrant housing paradigms. We believe that no advances in social housing design can be achieved without advances in housing policy and housing economy. Political economy that could support alternative social densities, transitional uses, and shared economies found within migrant neighborhoods. The UCSD Casa Community Station begins with the adaptive reuse of a beloved historic church that sat for decades in disrepair and which we were able to rescue through this project. During construction, the building had to be lifted to install new foundations. During times of so much political violence inflicted on this border community, the surreal image of the church levitating with Tijuana's informal settlements in the distance inspired a sense of hope for local residents. So with the renovation of this historic building as a catalyst, we initiated a process to transform small parcels into infrastructures for social, economic, and cultural production, reorganizing small lots into linear public systems to strengthen and expand an existing network of old alleys that are used by migrant residents as informal pedestrian corridors. This neighborhood-based urban framework supported our design of the UCSD Casa Community Station as a double project, a parcel-sized social infrastructure made of spaces for cultural and economic activity is flanked by affordable housing. So the organizational design of the parcel through a system of linear strips with a variety of small-scale buildings performing different roles was also a deliberate strategy to mobilize diverse financial streams to fund the different building typologies, synergizing university, community, and foundation economic resources. Our grassroots organization partner, Casa Familiar, in other words, has become now an alternative developer of affordable housing for its own community, and public space was a detonator. We renovated the historic church into a community theater with an outdoor stage. And this performance space is flanked on one side by a series of small accessory buildings for Casa Familiar's social programming, and on the other side by an open air civic pavilion. This social, educational, and cultural infrastructure anchors 10 units of affordable housing at both ends of the parcel, and they are all mediated by pedestrian walkways. We completed construction of this station in February, just before the COVID lockdowns hit and the residents moved in. It is finally opening up, and we are very excited because this is a site built and designed for social proximity. We are returning now to in-person engagement to develop cultural programming with our partners. Affordable housing takes on a different meaning when it is threaded into spaces for social programming, summoning residents to participate in the development of local economy and cultural production, synergizing spaces, programs, resources, and people. In other words, this is an integrated social spatial system that is programmed by university and community. And before moving across the border, allow me to pause just a moment to summarize how our Casa Community Station truly exemplifies several building blocks in our practice. In conditions of poverty, housing needs to be embedded in an infrastructure of social, economic, and cultural support. In other words, we must rethink affordable housing from autonomous units into relational social systems. Housing must be public infrastructure. Density should not be measured as an abstract number of objects or people per area. Density must be understood instead as the intensity of social and economic exchanges per area. Migrant neighborhoods have taught us that these exchanges mobilized by bottom-up urbanization is the DNA for democratizing the city into more inclusive and plural environments. Zoning must stop being punitive, preventing socialization. Instead, it should be conceptualized as a generative tool that anticipates, stimulates, and organizes social and economic activity in neighborhoods. The developer's pro forma is architecture's financial plastic. Inside the mathematics of this spreadsheet, our services as architects amounts to 15% of a project's construction cost. This undercapitalized asset can be mobilized as collateral for development. Nothing should prevent us as architects from becoming developers of our own projects. And by association, nothing should prevent communities from doing the same. The sweat equity, in other words, of architects, cultural producers, and community leaders, the economic equity of public universities, and municipal protocols for accessing public parcels, all of that can be bundled, aggregated, to enable communities to develop their own neighborhoods. And truly, that has been our story. So moving now across the border, our two community stations in Tijuana are located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement adjacent to the border wall. I will take a few moments to describe this incredible context. This location is at an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyons in Mexico clash with the border wall before spilling northbound into an environmentally protected estuary in San Diego in the US, now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between natural and jurisdictional systems and between ecological and political priorities is incredibly profound. And as we zoom in further, we witness a collision between the estuary in the US, the border wall, and the informality of the Laureles Canyon in Mexico, which is home to 92,000 people. This aerial video shows Laureles Canyon and the precarious condition of the informal settlement that has sprawled on its slopes. The site sits 30 minutes away from our campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and poverty in our region. Laureles Canyon is also impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding, and landslides, and all of this is exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change. And because Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure to mitigate these impacts, much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows downstream, ending in the estuary in San Diego, contaminating this bioregional and shared binational asset. Here, everyone, the border wall is truly an artifact of environmental insecurity. These impacts have intensified in recent years because of the profound lack of collaboration between San Diego and Tijuana to manage these cross-border flows. In the last decades, 70% of the open lands in Laureles Canyon have been lost to irregular urban growth. We have been identifying and bundling on squatted lands in the settlement that are still environmentally rescuable to shape an archipelago of conservation. We are advancing an ambitious regional project called the Cross-Border Commons, an environmental conservation initiative that links the estuary in the US with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the border wall and protects the environmental systems shared between these two border cities. With our Tijuana partners, we have curated a coalition of state and municipal agencies, nonprofits, and universities on both sides of the wall, and have negotiated with the municipality in Tijuana to adopt the remaining unsquatted public lands inside this informal settlement. Another important contextual note before I introduce one of the Tijuana stations is that Laureles Canyon is a site of informal urbanization. As we have researched and written about over many years, the informal settlements of Tijuana are built with the waste from San Diego, recycling architectural parts to construct habitation and infrastructure. We have learned a great deal from these incremental building practices as people construct their own shelter in layers over time. In a case study we documented, a metal frame appeared from one day to another. In a couple of months, recycled materials began to thread the spaces, and in the next weeks, an informal house emerged. We have also taken note that multinational factories or maquiladoras surround these informal settlements to benefit from easy access to cheap labor. So over the years, we have been experimenting with factory-made material systems to structurally mediate the recycling of waste. We have proposed an ethical loop where factories invest in emergency housing. So here we are inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquiladora that produces lightweight metal shelving systems for global export, adapting its prefabricated materials into structural scaffolds for informal housing. We designed a catalog with the factory engineers to test a variety of prototypes and configurations. The first Mecalux typology is shown here with adapted recycled urban waste from San Diego, illustrating how top-down institutional resources can support the bottom-up creative intelligence of informal urbanization. A couple of years ago, we built the first study, and actually being inside the factory, everyone redirecting its material systems to and profits really to sites of emergency was an important milestone in our research-based practice. So it was important to introduce you briefly to these contextual processes because our community stations in Tijuana operate within this rich ecology of social, environmental, economic, and material relations. Now, let me share one of these stations. The UCSD Alacran community station is located in the most rugged, precarious, and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesus, a religious organization led by activist pastor Gustavo Banda and Zaida Guillen. With limited resources, they began a refugee camp to provide shelter, food, and basic services to hundreds of Haitian and Central American refugees while they navigated unjust asylum processes in the US and Mexico. And with the help of skilled migrant labor, they began building their own emergency housing. We established a long-term partnership here to co-develop a community station with them to increase refugee housing capacity. We are now accelerating the production of Mecalux frames to install them on vernacular concrete systems into housing infrastructures. Together now we are building Santuario Frontera. The housing scaffolds will be built first, leaving the interiors as planned open systems equipped with utilities to support incremental live-work configurations. These envelopes will be infilled through time by the migrant residents themselves. We see migrant housing, in other words, as a mechanism for generating jobs. In order to sustain the construction processes over time, we have been designing what we call a sanctuary economy, embedding housing in spaces of fabrication, training, small-scale economic development. We have assembled a refugee cooperative, the Little Haiti Construction Company, with the 2 library, wooden metal machines, and a couple of trucks and tractors. The community will complete construction of the site, and the cooperative will remain operational for future habitat restoration jobs across the canyon to advance our cross-border commons. Santuario Frontera began construction last summer. The migrant community assembled the Mechalux shelving systems into housing frames, and we also began the healing of the topography, creating hydrofiltration channels, gabion terracing, and water collection systems, advancing migrant housing as a restorative ecological infrastructure. We are now developing a full-on sanctuary neighborhood with social services, a school, hydroponics farm, a health clinic, a collective kitchen, and economic incubators. For us, refugee camps are a global laboratory for rethinking the city as a more integrative and inclusive ecosystem, where infrastructure can be an agile and anticipatory social spatial system capable of negotiating both transition and rootedness, the ephemeral and the permanent. Santuario Frontera has advanced important building blocks in our practice as well, and let me just finish with two in particular. Urban informality decolonizes the meaning of infrastructure. For us, the informal is not just an aesthetic category, but in fact, the informal is a praxis, a dynamic set of urban operations from below that counter and transgress top-down political power and exclusionary economic models. And hospitality, while it is the first gesture when the immigrant arrives, an essential charitable opening, a first step in creating a more welcoming society. As needs become more complex over time, charity is not the appropriate model for building an inclusive society. We need to move from hospitality into inclusion. So thinking beyond shelter is a call for rethinking refugee camps everywhere, from places of short-term habitation and service provision to durable infrastructures for inclusion.
There's so much more to say about the community stations, about our amazing partners and what we do together in these spaces. While the stations focus on different issues reflecting the priorities of each community, they all aspire to foster solidarity and collective agency, and to counter exploitation, dispossession, deportation, and environmental calamity. Here, we want to cultivate an elastic civic identity from the bottom up, ultimately reimagine jurisdiction in a militarized border zone. We curate unwalling experiments that dissolve the wall using visual tools like diagrams and radical cartographies to situate border neighborhoods within broader spatial ecologies of circulation and interdependence, from local to regional to continental, and ultimately to global scales. We see elasticity as a kind of civic skill, the ability to stretch and return between local and more expansive ways of thinking, to understand one's challenges within broader processes, and to envision possibilities for solidarity across walls. Here at the border, the idea of the bioregion, the binational watershed system, has been a powerful imaginary for activating more elastic civic thinking. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border public action through one of the sewage drains that the US had carved into the wall between the Larelas Canyon and the estuary that Teddy introduced you to earlier. We negotiated a permit with Border Control to transform this drain into an official port of entry southbound for 24 hours. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-description as just artists, as long as Mexican immigration officials were waiting on the other side of the wall to stamp our passports. Our convoy was comprised of 300 local activists, representatives from both cities, San Diego, Tijuana, and border activists from around the world. We summoned agencies that are typically at odds with one another. And as we moved together southbound under the wall, we witnessed slum wastewater and plastics flowing northward toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing from estuary to slum through a militarized culvert and the stamping of passports amplified the most profound conflicts and interdependencies of our border region. The great insight here was that protecting the vulnerable US estuary demands shared investment in the informal Mexican settlement. So in this cultural experiment, we went down. But sometimes nurturing elastic civic identities requires ascending up. Imagine a migrant child standing on a narrow sliver of land hundreds of feet above the border wall, right here at a place called Mirador. Imagine she plants her feet facing due west with the Pacific Ocean in front of her, Mexico to her left, the US to her right. Below to her immediate left, she sees the dense informal settlement where she lives and its proximity to a country that she is not allowed to enter. Below to her immediate right, almost directly beneath her feet, she sees the border wall, which from this vantage looks like a flimsy and ridiculous strip inserted into a vast and powerful natural system. Lifting her eyes, she sees the green expanse of the estuary with its vulnerable wetland habitats, and further beyond still, you can't see it in this photo, downtown San Diego rising vertically into the sky. From this vantage, all the characters of this contested zone come to life. And we've witnessed this moment of recognition again and again over the years. There are few places on earth, we argue, where the collision of informality, militarization, environmental vulnerability, and the proximity of rich and poor can be so vividly experienced. But in reality, the conflicts that we experience here locally between nation and nature are reproduced again and again along the entire trajectory of the continental border between the US and Mexico. Over the years, we've collected aerial photos like these that document precise moments when the jurisdictional line collides with natural systems, powerfully illustrating what dumb sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our Mexus project then imagines what this continental border zone looks like without the line. Mexus dissolves the border wall into a bioregion whose shape is defined by the 8 binational watershed systems bisected by the wall. Mexus also exposes other systems and flows across this bioregional territory: tribal nations, protected lands, croplands, urban crossings, many more informal ones, 15 million people and more. Ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of citizenship and cooperation beyond the nation state. Here it is in 2018 at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Now, the final civic stretch, literally, and the end of our talk, is a visualization project we call the Political Equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana across the planet, forming a corridor of global conflict between the 30th and 38th parallels north. Along this trajectory lie some of the world's most contested and violent thresholds. The US-Mexico border at San Diego, Tijuana, the most trafficked international checkpoint in the Western Hemisphere. The Strait of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, the main routes from North Africa into Fortress Europe. The Israeli-Palestinian border that divides the Middle East. India-Kashmir, a site of enduring territorial conflict since partition. The border between North and South Korea, representing decades of intractable Cold War conflict, and China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea, along with Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, visualizing this political equator in red, alongside the climatic equator below in green, was an astonishing discovery for us, because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains our planet's most populous slums, its sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export, and its zones of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, and human displacement. When these parallel lines are applied to the Pierce quincunxial projection, from above, the Arctic is centered, with its melting ice caps detonating sea level rise, dramatic coastal vulnerability, and human displacement. In the end, the collision of nationalism and border building, climate catastrophe, and the dramatic movement of peoples is the global injustice trifecta of our time. But as we said at the beginning, and there's much hope in this, these dynamics always hit the ground somewhere and are experienced by people locally in everyday places like ours and also yours. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to experiment with this. I don't know if this is playing in this room, but thank you both for that so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any questions that anyone wants to start off? We have time for a few questions. If you want to go ahead and use this mic, and they can see you here, so you can introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Andrew Petrus. I'm a second-year Bachelor's of Architecture student. I was really interested in your discussion of building trust with the community, and I was wondering how you navigate and build that trust in an environment that's so used to exploitation.
Well, one thing that I can say is it takes a long time. And it's not always easy because people are coming to the table with different priorities, different agendas, different temporalities, right? Communities are moving very fast because they're struggling every day with all of these challenges. And researchers and designers and universities move very slow. They're on a very different time scale. So one thing we often see is a lot of temporal conflict. But what we've done is we've created the community stations, build that trust over time, because it's not something that can happen in the typical kind of academic one-off projects that are common in design schools and in other areas of the university. So one thing to say is there's no easy solution to this. But what we've noticed is that being present for the long haul and learning how to listen is essential. Just simply an agenda and say, this is what we want to do, and we have a grant, or we're doing a project for a class, and this is how we're defining it. I think the most important thing is for researchers and designers to learn how to listen. It's not that you're coming without knowledge, right? Everybody's bringing their knowledges. But as an institution of power, we need to learn how to surrender and just listen. And this, again, sometimes is operating on a different temporality, which is why long-term partnerships between universities and communities are such a great idea. Maybe Teddy can add more to that.
Yes, and probably, we benefit from being rooted here. I mean, we decided many years ago that to participate on one hand on a global conversation, we needed to go deeper into the political specificity of this geography. And so we define our practice as an embedded practice that has been rooted here for many, many years. And so we've been accompanying, as we said before, these very complicated processes with our community partners for a long time. We've been present. And obviously that allows for certain levels of trust to evolve. But even then, we need to constantly demystify the role of universities, who often just come in to use communities as a object of analysis and then withdraw. We have signed social agreements, if I may call them that, with our community partners to really be with them in the long haul, which establishes a system of reciprocity and obviously of mutual responsibility. And finally, I'm thinking your question is fundamental. How do we build trust? How do we, what mechanism, what pedagogical, what kind of curatorial projects we need to engage for facilitating the meeting of knowledges? Because even though, as Fonna says, we have to go there and just listen, sometimes we also need to also make a case to advocate for new points of access towards a more expansive imagination, a sense of hope that often has been eroding and has been disappearing in many of these communities. So we are not afraid to come in, to share our own knowledges as professionals, but also as ways to conceptualize the spatialization of justice, only to support the social and political agendas of our partners, who then give us the knowledge of their everyday practices, the creative intelligence embedded in their modes of survivability and solidarity. So the exchange of knowledge, when done in such legitimate sort of effort across time, being present, redirecting resources, and so on, enables the concretization, let's say for a moment, of those trust foundations, I think. So I'm talking about the fact that our practice is also a curatorial practice, a translational practice, and that our partners are our partners in advancing that possibility.
And that, and that trust, I think, enables a kind of honesty between partners that doesn't exist in the one-off, right? Where there has to be the kind of ethnographic sensitivity when you arrive in a community. So trust enables that kind of flow where there can actually be conflict. We experience conflict with our partners all the time, right? But we know we can get through that because we've built so much longevity with each other.
Thank you.
Another question, or I will maybe go ahead.
Hi, can you guys hear me through my mask?
Yes.
Thank you for your beautiful lecture and really powerful work. Could you speak more to the question of communities and people becoming their own developers and kind of garnering resources to make a project like the project that you did, for example? I imagine that to be a really complex legal, financial, undertaking. So could you just speak to that for a little bit?
Fonna, do you want to? Or?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes. Obviously, it's a major area of our research. How do we participate in the designing of political and economic process? For a long time, we became dissatisfied with the hierarchies established by the architectural profession, where architects sit passively waiting for a client that can then provide a brief, that then can provide a budget, and that through design processes, we can really accomplish the best we can. And of course, there is nothing wrong with that. I don't want to denigrate the profession of architecture and our capacity to build up our own economic sustainability through the job that we perform. But at some point, we realized that in order to engage the sites of marginalization and exclusion that have been the focus of our work, we needed to also begin to co-produce the client, and from that, maybe begin to co-curate the brief, and why not to say it, to really imagine new forms of economic pro forma, and even access to the summoning of the constituencies that could accompany us to push the institutions to transform land use policies that have prevented developing the type of densities, the type of relational housing systems that we wanted to address. So in other words, we are again interested in architects retaking the power for really advancing a new proposition about public policy, housing agendas, and economy. At that point, we were lucky to be part of a community here in San Diego where many colleagues of ours have been advancing our own sweat equity as architects, as we mentioned, as collateral for development. It's an invisible asset. 15% of the construction cost is huge that you can put on the table for processing conventional construction loans. And then it's really a leverage. And if you aggregate to that, let's say, and this is the argument we made to the president of our university, the chancellor of our university, if we can leverage the economic power of our university, by that I mean the access to philanthropic networks, foundations, the facilitation of how to assemble that knowledge, we can redirect a lot of support for communities to be developers of their own housing and public space. And at that point, we realized that many of these nonprofits who actually are in very marginalized, underserved neighborhoods, they have begun to acquire land, some of them. So they already have the incredible capital, the incredible asset of land ownership. And also, similar to us, they already possess in their own framework incredible programmatic capacity, right? That qualifies for funding in the best moments of our public policy, right? When the social safety net is in a state of health, then they can receive support, and that support can be aggregated as well, equal also to our sweat equity, the sweat equity of community activists who through volunteerism and through time banking and through, we can begin to argue that can be really be translated into an investment. Obviously, all of this needs to be, again, curated, synergized, and packaged in the right way. And that's another aspect of our interest, how architects can become also designers of new political representation of the invisible, so that we can argue and represent that knowledge, that time, that voluntarism, that capacity. Obviously, that enables us to really produce a pro forma. So in one of the projects that we didn't show today, one of our 3 community stations, our partnership is with a nonprofit that deals with environmental justice, because of our collaboration between a major research university like ours and that grassroots organization. The school district of San Diego gave us access to a 40-year lease of a 4-acre piece of land. Now we have land. And when the university said, if the school district invests in the public infrastructure to shape what is becoming a climate action park, to serve 8 public schools that are in this underserved neighborhood, the university will match by investing in the programmatic funding to support the activities in perpetuity. So it became a model of school district, grassroots organization, university, co-producing and co-developing a public space for environmental justice. To see what I'm trying to say is about how we curate cross-sectorial, cross-institutional synergies to again elevate the idea that we cannot just be giving private developers the carte blanche to shape the destiny of the city without any investments in public infrastructure. But in fact, we need to open the horizon of points of access to other coalitions of knowledge to develop the city. Let's develop the city with others. This is our main desire. It's complex. We would have to go into the details. It's complex.
And let's also remember, as an institution of higher education, huge asset that this becomes then for training students and educating students, right? So in a very ethical way, because the students are then sort of stewarded into networks of existing partnerships, rather than, to the typical academic internship program, which again is this sort of series of one-offs. We've been very critical of the eager, well-intended university that sends thousands of hormiguitas into the field, that become this major drain on nonprofits who can't handle all of our enthusiasm, right? So what we've set up is a network that receives students with the human infrastructure there to manage them, right? So it's become a really wonderful way of doing community-based education on our campus as well.
Another question, or I will sneak in then maybe a last question, if I may, which in a way relates to these last 2 questions. And it's around a link or potential link between optimism and imagination. So for me, it's really exciting to see, even some of these construction photos, because there's a sort of life in a way that a number of these interventions sort of in a way take on in the world as they iterate and evolve towards becoming manifest in the world. And maybe I'm reading perhaps too much into the narrative that you present, but it seems that on a certain level, some of these projects are rooted in a need for alternative imaginations, that people only see problems and you're trying to sort of make opportunities visible. And there's a level at which some of these interventions begin almost as kind of artistic or representational provocations to allow people to sort of see an image that can birth something in their imagination, that can lead to dialogue, that can eventually lead to something built in reality. And in order to encourage people to embark on some of these journeys, you have to feed them with optimistic pictures to encourage their participation. If you highlight all the potential downsides or the risks or the negative dimensions, it's harder, I'm guessing, to kind of galvanize people into traveling with you. So if you followed me with that kind of what if or kind of series of assumptions, if any of that is vaguely true, the question is, do you find it on some level or on certain occasions counterproductive? Are there moments or aspects of this work where you feel almost encumbered by a need to project optimism when it seems that when perhaps another approach might work? Is that an issue at all? If it's not an issue, why is that? And if it's somehow an issue, in what ways is it, and how do you what are your countermeasures?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that question. I think your description, look, if we didn't have optimism and if we couldn't muster that in ourselves, we couldn't be doing this kind of work. There are times, and when you do public interest work, there are times when we wake up feeling this like nagging sense of like futility, and that we're swimming against the stream, and there's so many challenges and there's so many obstacles, and the truth is that our communities continually to inspire us with their incredible resilience and sort of scrappy adaptability to whatever's coming up the road. And so we learn a lot from them in this sense. I can say that the community partners sometimes keep us optimistic when we're falling, right? But look, one of the things that happens, and we've noticed this not only here, but in projects around the world, is that people can become inured the injustices that they face every day. And sometimes people living in conditions of extreme injustice, one of the coping mechanisms that we've witnessed over our careers is just a kind of an accommodation to reality and almost accepting it as the way of the world. And one of the approaches that we take, rather than this just sort of abstract optimism, is working with communities to peel away the sense of inevitability and really understanding the injustice of what they're facing every day. Not that it's just the way of the world, not that it's just this is what me and my community deserve, buying into the American narratives that maybe we don't work hard enough, maybe we don't deserve it. There are all sorts of ways that people begin to justify the conditions they find themselves in. So for example, these communities at the border, I'll just give you a very concrete example. These communities just north of the border in Southeast San Diego have, just persistent respiratory challenges. Emphysema, lung disease is much higher in the communities that right along the border. Why? Because of hundreds of thousands of idling cars every week, spewing this stuff into the air and people breathing it in. And over time, these communities have gotten used to the fact, we just have higher rates of lung disease here. Well, let's unpack that and understand there were actually human beings that made a decision to put your child's school next to a freeway that was going to be blocked up by a national border. Somebody made that choice. And the only way that that is going to change is that human beings make a different choice, right? So to begin to see injustice and possibilities for agency to overcome that injustice, that's one of the things. So I would characterize that I think DK has a different approach. There's the kind of sitting around a table and looking at images and thinking about possible futures. And then there's taking the trauma, unpeeling it, and understanding the injustice that's inside of it. And that builds capacity. It politicizes what can otherwise be a pathetic kind of acceptance of reality.
So
I hope
in that
your question.
in that sense, and maybe without expanding too much further, because you said it all, but we believe that in a way our practice have always been a pessimistic, optimistic kind of, practice, a double project. On one hand is to unpack that, right? That whole complexity. We've always believed that art and architecture is a cognitive tool for communities to access that complexity. And so therefore images become political tools to reveal what had not been evident. And so on one hand, this double project is on one end, a project that visualizes the institutional mechanisms that have produced the conditions of the crisis, but we don't stay there static as social scientists who only measure the problem but never advocating for a possible, let's not call it solution, but a way of transcending the problem. But in fact, we then begin to be propositive, and at that point, we are grounding images and visualization processes on the more, as you called it, maybe optimistic, but is more political, obviously, notion of optimism, because what we are trying to also translate, again, is not only the conditions that have produced the crisis, but also the creative intelligence embedded in places of urgency where human capacities are never understood or taken into account in the processes to reimagine development or the rethinking of politics, etc. So I think that at this point is the carrying of that information upward to transform, institutions is one major aspect of our optimism. And I think that, that's what also has, by the way, enabled us to build trust, because we are saying there is something here of value that is not being taken into account. Let us co-produce the visualization processes and the modes of representation that can legitimize ultimately the value, the hidden value of all of this in reimagining, how to tackle those problems. You see what I'm trying to say? It's a double project, one amplifying the kind of fatalism, right? Because it seems like we are at the dead end, but also carving tunnels of possibility in collaboration with others. I mean, this is, and by the way, we are masochists. Why not to say it, right? I mean, this is like, and we will never cease to be optimists, because when we come in contact with a Salvadorian immigrant just 2 days ago who tells us about his dreams and as well as the struggles, but still a sense that there is the rights, right, to imagine a future as much as there are the rights, of people to migrate to improve their own lives, right? So I think that we constantly get contaminated in a positive sense by the resilience, as Fonna was saying, by the strength and the struggle of migrants, because I think they wouldn't be doing this otherwise if they did not remain positive and optimistic that there is somewhere a better horizon to improve their own lives and of their families.
So I said I would have the last word, but I was reminded that this presentation is itself without walls, and there were some questions from online. So I'll try and squish them into a last final maybe question, and maybe you can leave us with any advice you may have. And so this is a kind of combined question from our colleagues Malika and Mark online, which, if I combine them, says, thanks for a thought-provoking presentation. My question has to do with the discipline and the profession. What are your thoughts regarding architecture and landscape architecture education? Because here at the Stuckeman School, we actually have both of these, as well as graphic design. What are your thoughts regarding architecture and landscape architecture education in terms of preparing students to engage in this kind of practice? What recommendations, if any, do you have in terms of curriculum in the academy and practices for the profession, which links to a kind of broader maybe question about in terms of this developer model, which has implications by extension for the profession. Do you have any other thoughts maybe on the kind of ground up place recognition and social affordance? Is there room for licensure in this kind of potentially alternative model? So maybe your last thoughts on that. And
I mean, I think Teddy should take this question primarily, but one thing that I can just, I'm not an architect, I'm a social scientist. But one thing that I've recognized again and again as Teddy and I visit architecture schools and teach studios in architecture schools is that students are demanding this of their architectural education. Not all of them, right? But there's a subset of students that are demanding that they cultivate the tools and the experiences to do more publicly engaged work. So I think that architecture schools need to respond, and some are responding more quickly than others. But I'll let Teddy take it from there.
Well, you know, after all, and I don't think I consider Fonna as social scientist. She's a political theorist.
Thank you.
And I think that what we in our practice, what we've done also is that we have blurred the border or transcended the border that separates two sides of campus. Okay, the two fields that very seldom collaborate. We're very interested in the how would I call it, the exchanges of procedures. Can social scientists think more spatially? Can architects think more socially and more politically through the recognition of hidden histories of oppression, of the institutional sort of frameworks that have rendered the city already as a set, invisible framework within which we just install or insert our highly, or you know, whatever, beautifully designed objects. Nothing against aesthetics, but can we reorganize resources, jurisdictional power? That's an expansion of the field of design. Nothing to compromise the fact that we need to learn the techniques and be professionals and get the license. Nothing to compromise that. But it could be that some of us are more masochistic, that we want to expand that field, so we are designing other systems, primarily in our time. Because today's radical reality and the drama of the crisis today demands a new theory, demands new forms of practice, demand, in a way, other forms of design, designing radical pedagogies, forms of engagement. Why not designing rights themselves for access? At least our work, it took, and DK knows this because we know each other for a long time. It took a long time to really get to the build project. Because for a while, we were building a position. And that's all that it is, I think. I think schools need to rethink themselves in the context of advocacy and really head-on opening up, right? New sites of investigation, new places of intervention, of engagement. And that simply is about shifting the gaze. And by doing that, when internalizing the possibility of changing our pedagogies in our forms of reference, it's simply that. So I think that it's just more about expanding and even including in the university and our schools of architecture, other actors. When we begin our projects, we actually create a diagram, which we call the 5W sort of conflict diagram, where we always ask 5 Ws: why, who, where, what, when. And we fill in that table in order to diagram a kind of relational map that includes evidence of, you know, why are we doing this, for whom and why, and how. And through that, we begin to identify the institutional, you know, all the institutions, the actors, the policies that have impacted those who are suffering, and how those who are suffering have capacities. And so we create a script, an urban script that is very there. So what I'm trying to say is that there are tools that we can begin to conceptualize. We're interested in the idea that architects today are not only designers of objects, but are designers of processes that can really set a different ground from which more just, more inclusive, more integrative, ecologically and beyond architectures can emerge from.
What a great final word. Thank you again so much, Fonna and Teddy. Thank you from all of us here, and we'll let you take off because you're now playing in a room. So thank you so much.
DK, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.